a good Thanksgiving. I imagine, probably like my family, many of you guys, most of you guys got together with some other people. Or you got to have a very peaceful Thanksgiving all by yourself, maybe. My Thanksgiving, it was chaotic. It was a lot of fun. There was 30 of us all at my dad's house for at least 2 days, and some of us were there for like 7. And the kids, my kids aren't here today because like my wife said, they're feeling a little bit sick. And they're probably sick because they're crazy. Most of the kids that I get together with over there, they're pretty much just crazy. They were running around. My wife mentioned this to some people. It's like 50 degrees. They'll get up in the morning and it's like 45, 50 degrees. And they're in like a t-shirt and shorts and barefoot running around my dad's property on freezing cold cement and just happy as can be. And one of the things that my crazy kids did was we were there, and my son, who it was his birthday while we were gone, and he brought his airsoft stuff there. Which airsoft, for those of you who don't know, it's kind of like paintball. Basically, they're toy guns that are really impressive actually, and they shoot little round plastic BBs, and you can go out and you can play war with each other, things like that. So my son came to my dad at one point, and he said, and my dad is called Tata to all of his kids, to all his grandkids. So my son came to my dad, he said, Tata, do you care, would you mind, if we got up early tomorrow morning? I think this was on Tuesday or something like that, because his birthday was on Wednesday. So Tuesday, he said, Tata, do you mind if we get up early tomorrow morning and we can go out because we want to shoot each other? So that one kid will just stand there and the other one takes a gun and just, shoots him. Because it's so much fun, because that's what kids think. And so Tata said, yeah, that's fine. And then my son even said, well, we were thinking about, because there's a big field next to my dad's house, we're thinking about going out there to the field and just standing there and just shooting each other tomorrow morning. And my dad said, sure, yeah, that's okay. That field, it just stays empty. I think that'll be fine. So my son came to me and he's like, yeah, Tata said it was okay. He said in the morning, so we're gonna get up at like 2:30 a.m. and we're gonna go out into the field next door and we're gonna shoot each other. And I said, whoa, hold on a second. Hold your horses. What did you ask Tata? And he said, I asked Tata if we could get up in the morning and go shoot each other across to the neighbor's field. I said, okay, your understanding of getting up in the morning and Tata's understanding of getting up in the morning might be a little bit different. So I told him, no, you cannot go into the neighbor's house with a very authentic looking weapon and go shooting other people. This is not a good idea, son. Not a good idea at all. And he did not understand that while my dad had given permission for a reasonable thing, most people would think in the morning, 7, 8, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock in the morning, if you sleep in a little bit, that's what normal people think. But that's not what my son had in mind. So my dad had given a law or a rule or permission, but the heart of that permission was very different than what my son understood. And this happens all the time. Now, there was nothing particularly foul or bad about my son was going to do. They were just going to go out and play, and they ended up being too tired in the morning and didn't do it anyway, which I was happy about. But the idea is this. What the rule was, the heart of my dad's response was very different than what my son's understanding of that law was, right? My dad understood the heart of it was like, yes, it's okay to go do that, with sort of an assumption that, but not at 2 in the morning, like, well, that's just crazy. But my son held on to the technical aspect, because technically 3 a.m. is the morning. Technically, it is the morning. So my son was holding on to the legality of it, the words of the law, but not really the heart. Right? And as we come to this conclusion of the book today, while my son's interpretation was rather, not that important, not that big of a deal. But today, as we look at this last chapter, we're going to see the people of Israel do that. but the consequences are far more substantial. We're going to watch them as they go through and they make all of these technicalities. They're going to see and assume that they're honoring God, but the way that they interpret it is not really the heart of what God has commanded them to do. That's what's going to happen as we look at this very last chapter in the book of Judges today. But before we do that, would you pray with me? Father, there's so much to thank you for. We thank you for your word. We thank you for your mercy. We thank you for your kindness. We thank you for your law. We thank you that even as we look at this text, the reality is that you have given us your word, and really what that is it's the revelation of your character and your nature and your constant moving to implementing that in the lives of your people. Father, we want to be a people who not only understand what your law says, but understand the heart of you, our sovereign King. Because we want to live as you live, we want to do as you do, we want to love as you love, and we want to despise evil as you despise evil. And so, Father, as I bring your word to bear, I pray that you would give me the grace to accurately demonstrate your character and your nature as you have revealed yourself in your word, that we might love you, that we don't simply become legalists to the letter of the law and try to manipulate the words into doing things that we know aren't really your intent, Father, just as Israel has shown itself to do. Help us to truly be faithful to you, to seek after you with all of our heart, mind, soul, and strength as we reflect on your word this morning. Amen. So this morning is the conclusion of the book of Judges. And it's kind of interesting that it happens at the beginning of Advent. And I think it's rather relevant. But as a quick review, as we walk over some of the things that have already taken place, if we remember at the beginning of this story, just a couple of chapters back, there was a Levite and he had a concubine. And this Levite threw his concubine out to the city of Gibeah that they might take her and do whatever they wanted with her all night. And so Israel responds, rightfully so, with horror and indignation at what this city has done to this woman. It was awful and terrible and evil and vile. And rightfully so, the people of Israel say, this should never be in Israel. And so they go and they destroy the city of Gibeah and the vast majority of all of the tribe of Benjamin along with it. And as we did that last week and the week before, we looked at the tribe of Benjamin and the people of Gibeah and rightfully so pointed out their sin and their failure and their rebellion against God and how very, very far away from, again, the nature and character of God they went. They came into the land with specific instructions to not be like the people of Canaan who did these kinds of vile things, just like Sodom and Gomorrah. And yet now we've seen God's people doing the same things as the Canaanites, just like Sodom and Gomorrah. And so for the last couple of weeks, we've been focusing on the failure of God's people to live up to God's standards, God's word, God's character, God's nature, Yahweh's nature, and instead be absolutely subsumed under the cultural understandings of the world around them, which was evil and vile and terrible. This week, we're going to look at the rest of Israel. Because on one hand, when you just look at those stories, you could set up the rest of Israel as these were the good guys and the people of Benjamin and Gibeah who clearly did evil as the bad guys. But as we go through this story, we actually find that there were many, many, many issues with what was going on in the rest of Israel too. And we're going to find that through this story. And we start off in Judges chapter 21, verses 1 through 5. I'm going to read it out of the ESV. You're welcome to read it there. It should be on the screen, or if you have another translation in your hand, that's okay. Read along with me. Judges chapter 21, verses 1 through 5. Now the men of Israel had sworn at Mizpah, no one of us shall give his daughters in marriage to Benjamin. And the people came to Bethel and sat there till evening before God, and they lifted up their voices and wept bitterly. And they said, O Lord, the God of Israel, why has this happened in Israel, that today there should be one tribe lacking in Israel? And the next day the people arose early and built there an altar and burnt offerings and peace offerings. And the people of Israel said, which of all the tribes of Israel did not come up as in the assembly to the Lord? For they had taken a great oath concerning him, who did not come up to the Lord to Mizpah, saying, he shall surely be put to death. Israel's response to Gibeah was justified. Gibeah was wrong. They did evil, and they were rightfully horrified. But there were issues with Israel's response and the way they understood things as well. In these first 5 verses, we see 2 oaths, 2 commitments made by the people of Israel. And I'll even qualify them in these first 5 verses. They were 2 unrequired and rushed oaths. They did not need to be made, and yet they were. The first oath that we see in that first verse is that they decided, there's no biblical commandment, there's no requirement here, but they decided that they were not going to allow the tribe of Benjamin to continue by allowing them to take any daughters from any of the rest of Israel. They made an oath to that point. They will not give their daughters to Benjamin. And the second oath was that if they discovered that anybody had not come to fight with them when they went up against Benjamin, that they would kill them. Anyone who didn't come to help them, they would slaughter them all. They didn't need to do this. There's no biblical requirement to make these oaths. And even later on, similarly to Jephthah, who made another rushed and foolish oath, for those of you who maybe remember that story, the reality is they could have even avoided these oaths after they made them. Leviticus chapter 5, verses 4 through 6. If anyone utters with his lips a rash oath to do evil or to do good, any sort of rash oath that people swear, and it is hidden from him when he comes to know it, and he realizes his guilt in any of these. When he realizes his guilt in any of these and confesses the sin he has committed, he shall bring to the Lord as his compensation for the sin that he's committed a female from the flock, a lamb or a goat for sin offering, and the priest shall make atonement for him and his sin. These 2 oaths made by the rest of, really, the elders of Israel to kill anyone who did not come help them and to deny Benjamin wives could have been rescinded, could have been repented from, but they did not. Like Jephthah, they made rash vows and held to them, and the consequences of those vows came at great, great cost. We see the first of these as we look at verses 6 through 14. Judges chapter 21, verses 6 through 14. And it says this: And the people of Israel had compassion for Benjamin their brother, and said, What tribe is cut off from Israel this day? What shall we do for wives for those who are left? Since we have sworn by the Lord that we will not give them any of our daughters for wives. And they said, What one is there of the tribe of Israel that did not come up from the Lord, up to the Lord, to Mizpah? And behold, no one had come to the camp from Jabesh Gilead to the assembly. For when the people were mustered, behold, not one of the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead was there. So the congregation sent 1,200 of their bravest men and commanded them, Go and strike the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead with the sword, with the edge of the sword. Also the women and the little ones. This is what you shall do. Every male and every woman that has lain with a male, you should devote to destruction. And they found among the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead 400 young virgins who had not known a man by lying with him. And they brought them with them to the camp at Shiloh, which is in the land of Canaan. And the whole congregation sent word to the people of Benjamin who were at the rock of Rimmon, and proclaimed peace to them. And Benjamin returned at that time, and they gave them the women whom they had saved alive of the women of Jabesh Gilead. But they were not enough for them. And so the people had compassion on Benjamin, because the Lord had made a breach in the tribes of Israel. Israel felt bad. After having done these things, God hadn't actually commanded them really even to wipe out all of the Benjamites. Even that was actually a decision that they made themselves to some degree. God did say, I will give you victory, but he did not say you have to kill every single man, woman, and child. It was not what God commanded them to do. But they made an oath, the people. And they felt bad after wiping them out, because in hindsight, after all of their heads probably cooled down a little bit, after they got over their being angry and they realized, Benjamin, one of our brothers, is wiped out. There's only 600 men left of the entire tribe. And if we don't do something, these men are going to be eliminated. All the while, the reality is it was on their own heads to some degree about why this came to pass. But they cry out to the Lord, weeping at the loss of Benjamin. And they made 2 oaths that bound them. The 2 oaths that we just read in the first 5 verses, now they're in this conundrum. They're in a pickle because they can't give them their daughters. And they made an oath to kill a bunch of other people who didn't come to help them. So out of their cleverness, they decided that maybe when you combine these 2 oaths and you put all of these pieces together, maybe because according to the letter of the law, maybe not according to the heart of the law of God, but according to the letter of the law of the oaths that they themselves decided to take upon themselves, not even given to them by God himself, they can work out a deal to where they can uphold the technicalities of their oaths and still give Benjamin what they need. And so in verse 11, we see this term. They're going to devote to destruction anybody who didn't come to help them. And the word they use here is a word harem, harim. I don't speak Hebrew, I'm sure I messed it up. But the idea of devoting destruction is the idea of harim, which is used in several other places, like Numbers 21, 2 through 3. It was used for the Canaanites. In Numbers 21, verses 2 through 3, we read, Israel vowed a vow to the Lord and said, if you will indeed give this people into my hand, then I will devote their cities to destruction. And this idea of devote, that same word is used, harim. And it's something that is being set aside. It's in some ways almost a sacrificial thing to God. In some ways it's setting aside. In some way it's the idea of it being cursed. And so this thing that's evil and cursed is sort of being set aside to destruction as a sort of worship to the Lord. That's what this term means. And it was used for the Canaanites, who had become indeed, just like the people of Gibeah, a people who were evil and did vile things, and they slaughtered each other, and everything in them, or so much in them, was in contrast to the holiness of Yahweh. And so God's people did say, There's so much evil happening here. We're going to destroy this evil. And as we destroy this evil, God, it will be in your name and for your glory. And now they're talking about doing this. Something that they actually didn't even fulfill in the land of Canaan. They never actually even did this. They were supposed to, but they didn't actually accomplish it. But ironically enough, when it comes to their own brothers and sisters, they say, we are also going to devote them to this holy destruction for the sake of the Lord. The only difference being, as I've read through this whole book, I never saw God ever ask them to destroy these people. God never asked them to do this. The only thing that we get maybe close to this is when we think back and if you remember the story of Deborah, and in the story of Deborah earlier in Judges, she sends some people out to go and collect all the people of Israel to go up against their enemies. And then in chapter 5, she has a song that she writes. And inside of this song, we see this. In verse 23, it says, "Curse Meroz, says the angel of the Lord. Curse its inhabitants thoroughly, because they did not come to help of the Lord, to the help of the Lord, to the help of the Lord against the mighty." This is the closest that we see of any commandment or anything close to what they're about to do to these people. And even here, God's not telling the people of Israel, go and slaughter the people who didn't help you. Man, woman, and child, kill them all. It says that God curses them, not people. And yet, ironically enough, here we see the people of Israel taking it upon themselves for this one small group of people who did not come to help them for who knows what reason. And yet they take it upon themselves to treat them like the Canaanites and go and just wipe them out, man, woman, and child. This was an unnecessary oath with no precedent, no command, no requirement for its fulfillment. When they didn't even have to keep, had they recognized that this was an evil oath that they made, and they could have repented from it. But instead, what they do is they put the pieces together of their own extra-biblical oaths, and they say, well, wait a second here. I guess there's a group over here. Check this out. There's a group over here. We made an oath to kill a bunch of people who didn't help us. This group over here didn't help us, and look, they've got women there. So if we go here and we slaughter all of the families, but we just leave the young women, we can take them and we can give them to the tribe of Benjamin. That's a good idea. Let's do that. This is not good. It was neither commanded by God, nor is it in accordance with anything to do with God's character and nature. So effectively, in fulfillment of their oath, they slaughter men, women, and children. They kidnap the young women of the land, and they hand them over. I don't know if you want to call it slavery, but they hand them over very involuntarily to these men to be their women with no price. Back in that day, and culturally speaking, maybe you would trade, and there was security in being attached to a man and having a household, and those were realities in that culture at that time. But here, there's no price being paid. There's nothing of honor happening here. It is simply the theft of their brothers' daughters after the slaughter of their families. This oath is terrible, and the consequences are terrible. And all of this because they're trying to maintain some kind of standard within a bunch of rules that they themselves created. Not God. They did this. But there wasn't enough of them. So after eliminating all of the fathers and the children and the wives who were already married, after wiping them all off the face of the earth, and after taking their daughters, there was only 400 of them, but there were 600 men in Benjamin. They needed another 200 women. So they keep going. And we read in verses 15 through 24 how they solve the problem of another 200 women. Verses 16 through 24. Then the elders of the congregation said, "What shall we do for the wives of those who are left?" since the women are destroyed out of Benjamin. And they said, there must be an inheritance for the survivors of Benjamin, that a tribe not be blotted out from Israel. Yet we cannot give them wives from our daughters, for the people of Israel had sworn, cursed be he who gives a wife to Benjamin. So they said, behold, there is the yearly feast of the Lord at Shiloh, which is north of Bethel, on the east of the highway that goes up from Bethel to Shechem, in the south of Lebanon. And they commanded the people of Benjamin, saying, go and lie in ambush in the vineyards and watch. If the daughters of Shiloh come out to dance in the dances, then come out of the vineyards and snatch each man his wife from the daughters of Shiloh, and go to the land of Benjamin. And when their fathers or their brothers come to complain to us, we will say to them, grant them graciously to us, because we did not take for each man of them his wife in battle, neither did you give them to them, else you would now be guilty. And the people of Benjamin did so, and took their wives according to their number from the dancers whom they carried off. Then they went and returned to their inheritance and rebuilt the towns and lived in them. And the people of Israel departed from there at that time, every man to his tribe and family. And they went out from there, every man to his inheritance. Now, I had to read through this a few times. I don't know about you guys, but trying to sort out exactly what's happening and what's going on here, I had to read through this a few times. So I'm going to walk through this a little bit. This is now a consequence of them saying, right, the first slaughter, the first evil was because they made a vow to kill anybody who didn't go with them. It was an unnecessary vow. It was not a biblical vow. The second vow was that they were not allowed to share any of their daughters with the tribe of Benjamin. Again, there was no biblical, Yahweh-mandated reason to make that vow, but they chose to. And then they bound themselves to their own vow. So now they're in this problem. They still need another 200 women for these men of Benjamin. They've already killed everybody and took the women of everybody they could. So what's left? Well, they come up with a scheme. Because while not holding to God's law is debatable, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, but holding to their own vows, that's unbreakable. Even if it's not really God's vows. But it's their vows, so it's unbreakable. And so they turn to trickery, treachery, and betrayal of their own people to accomplish this. Evidently what's about to happen is there's going to be a festival. We don't exactly know what this festival is going to be. I don't know exactly what it is, but there's a festival coming up. And they decide that at this festival, there's this group of people here in this festival, and what they're going to do is during this festival, they're encouraging the other 200 men who don't yet have their own women to go and to steal women from this festival. But in order to accomplish this, they're here in another little bit of a conundrum. Right? The guys who are there at Shiloh can't give their daughters to the Benjamites or else they'd be under a curse. So they can't give them to the Benjamites. And I would even propose that it might be the case that the men in Shiloh didn't want to give their daughters to the Benjamites. But basically what the elders do is they go to the men of Shiloh and they say, look, well, first they go to the Benjamites and they say, go do this. And if the people of Shiloh come and complain, here's what we're going to do. We're going to say, look, here's the problem. Those guys of Benjamin, they've got your daughters. So either they stole them from you or you gave them to them. Now, if you gave them to them, remember, what does that mean is going to happen because of the curse? So if they give them the daughters, everybody else comes in and kills all the people of Shiloh. So if the men of Shiloh complain about this little scheme, basically what the rest of the people of Israel are saying, the elders are saying, if you complain about this thing that we just put together, we're going to say, well, you gave them your daughters. You're cursed. We're going to come in and kill you all. We're going to wipe you all out unless you go along with our little plan. That's effectively what's happening here. And they carry this through. So the people of Benjamin come, steal the daughters, and the fathers and the brothers and all of these, the mothers, have no recourse to keeping their daughters. or else the rest of Israel will come and fight against them too. It was basically human trafficking, slavery, at sword point. And all of this, again, not because of a mandated necessity from God or from His Word, not because God said to do this, but because they decided that this oath was unbreakable, though we know it wasn't. They bound themselves to something they didn't need to bind themselves to, and out of binding that, they steal another 200 young women and give them to men. And I want to put this in context too. Don't forget, what were those men, why did those men not have wives anymore? It was because the people of Israel had gone into all of Benjamin and to Gibeah and not only took out the fighting men, but the women and the children and everybody there. And the reason that they had gone in to do all of that was because the men of Benjamin were defending the men of Gibeah who had just got through taking great advantage of a woman. So the men that are now stealing these young women are men who put their lives on the line to protect men so that they could rape women. This isn't good. This is not okay. And all of this because of a vow that they decided to make and that they made so they couldn't break because their vows were more important than the nature and character of God. None of this is okay. This is very similar. This issue of men, Jewish men, every man truly at the end of the day, deciding that our own systems, our own values, our own structures, our own rules, our own laws, oftentimes supersede God's own laws. Jesus himself would constantly battle this problem as he came. We see this in Mark chapter 7, verses 5 through 11. The same concept. And the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, Jesus that is, why do your disciples not walk according to the traditions of the elders, but eat with defiled hands? And he said to them, well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, the people honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. You leave the commandments of God and hold to the traditions of men. And he said to them, you have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition. Moses said, honor your father and your mother, and whoever reviles father or mother must surely die. But you say, if a man tells his father or mother, whatever you would have gained from me is Corban, that is given to God, then he's fine. This is the exact same issue. It's the exact same conundrum. The people of Israel were saying, man, we made these rules, we made these vows, and we have to stick to them, even if that means the death of our brothers and our sisters. God said, thou shalt not murder. But the people said, but we promised. And that promise meant more to them than God's own commandments. Just as here as Jesus is convicting and condemning the Pharisees because God said, honor your father and mother and take care of them. Don't just abandon them. And yet, these men are saying, well, I gave this money to God, so I can't give it to my parents. Well, there's no law that they had to give that money to God like that. But they chose to make that vow. And all of a sudden, their own vow became more meaningful and necessary and useful and more binding to them than even the word of the Lord. The very nature and character and goodness and holiness and righteousness of God became secondary to their own vows. They were just theirs. And that's exactly what the people of Israel are doing here. Their own vows are now worth more to them. And it's caged in righteousness. It looks pretty. It's got a veneer. Right? They talk about Yahweh. They talk about the Lord and they talk about celebrations to the Lord. That's at Shiloh exactly what was happening. They were worshiping God, the Lord, at Shiloh. And they used that as a cover to go and steal women. As if they're just cattle to be traded. As if they're tools to be used. That was never what God called them to do. But according to their own convictions, they found, well, this is a good idea. So they held their own convictions over and above the word of the Lord. And so at the end of this book, we find ourselves in an interesting position. We've seen sort of the two major failures, going from the very beginning. God brought the people of Israel into the land saying, you need to stay apart from the Canaanites. Do not live like they live. Do not do what they do. Do not be like them. Don't take their wives because they're going to sway you and they're going to turn you into them and you're going to perform evil acts that you have no business doing. You are mine. You are set aside for holiness, for righteousness, and for goodness. Don't be like them and don't do things like that. And at the end here, we find two things happening. We find one group of people being just like the Canaanites. Just like them. And we find another group, ironically enough, being just like the Pharisees that are to come. Looking on the outside like people who are serving God, but the reality is in their heart, they were far from Him. But they invoked His name to do the things that they wanted to do. So at the beginning of the book, there's hopefulness going into the land. God's people will usher in this time of hope and glory under the righteousness of God. And by the end of this book, we see that in many different ways, their hearts have walked away from Him. They did not pursue the revealed God of Scripture, the Torah, Matthew, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, which they had. They would hold to these legalese reasonings, to the letters, and manipulate the letter of the law, all in order to abandon the heart of the law and twist it to their own means. Do this all the time. Still happens. That's happened throughout all of human history. We go through and think about how many Catholics and Protestants have died fighting each other. All because they're saying, well, look, we want to show the love of God, so kill those guys because we disagree with them. But all in the name of the Lord. And the reality is it wasn't really in the name of the Lord, it was in the name of power, and they were simply invoking God in order to justify themselves. There's a group of Baptists far more recently who will go out, and our stance is that marriage is between one man and one woman, and that's it. Sex should happen between that marital status of one man and one woman, and that's it. That's what the word of the Lord says. That's what we're called to do. Right? So that is true. But there's also a church, many of you probably know about this, who've gone and they've gone to funerals, and they'll stand there with the vilest accusations, disagreeing with the people who I also disagree with. People who are homosexual and things like that, and they will go and they'll protest them in the vilest ways, calling them the ugliest things, and all in the name of the Lord, saying, you people are sick and you're disgusting and you're evil and you're vile and we hate you guys and God hates you guys, and all of these things, all in the name of the Lord. Is it true that God is against those things? Yes. But it is also true that God says to love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you. It is also true that every single one of us were enemies of God, and the demonstration of the nature of God is yes and absolutely to oppose evil and to make it clear that these things are wrong. But God sent His Son Jesus to die for those who are His enemies in the greatest demonstration of love. Do we call out wrong when it's wrong? Yes, we do. But we call it out in the hope that those would come to know Jesus and have hope and life and salvation through Him. We don't do it because we're trying to destroy people. We do it because we weep for them. because we long for their hearts and souls and minds. We still do this. I know people, and I've had friends not here who said, I don't really want to be amongst unbelievers. They're crass and they're crude and they're wrong. I don't want to be out there. I don't want to be a part of that world. Because I want to be in sort of my little holy huddle and just around the people who make me feel comfortable and who think the same way as me. And all couched in this idea of we need to be with believers and set up believing networks and all of these kinds of things. I'm not saying that you can't ever go to somebody because they're a Christian and you happen to be a Christian mechanic. That's fine. But the heart of the matter is that we are called by Christ to go and proclaim the excellencies of Him who called us out of darkness and into the marvelous light. We can't do that if we're only talking to other believers. We need to be people who are in the world and not of the world. So all of that to say, even still, we can oftentimes use legalese terms and escape the heart of God by trying to hold on to technicalities and couching them into my holiness. It happens all the time. Sometimes people will wear, and this is okay. If you want to wear a suit to church, that's great. I don't think we have any here, so this is a safe illustration. But it's okay to wear a suit to church. If somebody comes and they say, this is how I honor God, as I dress up in a suit and a tie and a tux, whatever, that's fine, that's great. It's okay to have ideals and principles and things like that. It's good, it's fine. But when we begin to alienate everybody else who isn't wearing a suit and say, you have to wear a suit to church or you don't love Jesus and I'm not going to fellowship. If you don't meet my standards, you must not love Jesus and you're probably not even really a believer and maybe you don't even care about God or maybe Jesus. Right? All of a sudden that becomes something that we use to glorify our King, and instead it becomes something that drives a wedge between us and our believers. And that's exactly what happens here in the people of Israel. Instead of holding to the biblical principles that God has given, they use their own ideas, their own vows, their own rules, their own morals, and they use it to slaughter their brothers and sisters. Just like the Pharisees when they hung Christ on the cross because he did not match what they wanted. And all of this gets summed up in the last verse of this book, the last little bit. And it says this: in those days, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. This author is very specific. Everyone. This is a pretty expansive statement. Whether it was by abandoning Yahweh in fact and in action and even in character, whatever, like the Canaanites, or whether it was pretending to follow God, but in their hearts actually abandoning Him. Either way, they weren't doing what was right in the eyes of Yahweh. They were doing what was right in their own eyes. Either living like the Canaanites or acting like the Pharisees, when what they should have been doing throughout this whole book. And Jesus quotes this too. Matthew 22:37 through 40. A verse I'm going to use over and over and over again. I have used on many occasions, and I hope I use so much that you guys get annoyed with me using this verse. And it's so ingrained in our hearts and our minds that it becomes a foundation of who we are. Because this is what was abandoned by these people. Somebody came to Jesus and asked him, what's the greatest law? The most important thing for us to follow? Jesus responds and he says to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law, all the prophets. And instead, what Israel was doing and where they ended up in this book is they were far more interested in the technical aspects of the law and the technical aspects of the prophets, and they forgot about loving God and loving their neighbor. And when they did this, they abandoned the actual law and the actual commandments. And they should have known this, because what Jesus was quoting was Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 6, chapter 4 through 5. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. But instead of being aware and loving and pursuing the character of God, they manipulated the rules to accomplish their own purposes. Neither of them, neither the people of Benjamin and the city of Gibeah, nor the rest of Israel, obeyed Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 5, or Jesus' words much later. And this is an interesting and timely sermon, because the reality of it is this whole problem, this whole complication, and I've said this, I know, I've talked to my wife, and this is a repeated application, just to warn you. All of this problem is because the hearts and the souls and the minds of people were broken. There was something broken that said, I don't really want to follow the character of God. And it broke all the way back in Genesis chapter 3. And it had been broken for a long time. And the reason that we have a candle lit here this morning, and the reason that we sing, and the reason that we gather, and the reason that we pray, and the reason that we preach, is because the whole point of the book of Judges is we are broken people. And don't for a second think that we avoid all of these mistakes. We do not. I'm guessing that every single one of us can think of 10 things where our own preferences and our own cultures and our own priorities became more important and stumbling blocks between our brothers and sisters and us, not because we were holding to God's biblical standards, but because we were holding to our personal, family, and cultural standards. And because you don't do the cultural thing that I do, I'm going to separate between you and me, despite the fact that Jesus Christ came and died to make us unified. In this case, in Israel, it led to death. But let's be honest. I mean, the reality is, as we go through Thanksgiving and Christmas, how many of us have battles over silly things, like how the table gets set and who cleans up and all of these things. And man, you have to load the dishwasher like this. Please point to me a verse where the dishwasher must be loaded like this. Doesn't. But I can point to you plenty of places where it says, love your spouse. Love your brothers and sisters. Humble yourself. Just as Christ humbled himself on the cross, making himself, allowing himself to die, not making himself equal with God. Be humble as he's humble and holy as he's holy. I can point to those verses. We can easily see, but we don't think of that, right? How many of us, when we get into debates and arguments, go, hey, I'm not sure that you're being gentle like Jesus and humble like... It's not almost ever what it comes across as. Usually it's, you violated my preference today. You've gone against the thing that I like. How could you? How dare you? What's mentally wrong with you that you would even do such a thing? That's often how we interact. And we all have people inside the church, outside the church, right? By God's grace and mercy, he forgives us and we submit our life more and more to him. But here's the reality. We are all susceptible to this. We're all susceptible to this. And that's why so many years ago, God sent his own son, Jesus Christ. Because we are a broken people. And here's a news flash. We will continue to be broken people. I'm not sure if you guys realize that or not. But we will all continue to be broken people who make bad decisions and get annoyed with each other and who do wrong things and who pursue wrong things. We're still going to do it. even if God allows us and sanctifies us to become more and more and more like His Son, it's never going to be entirely gone. Certainly not in me. I could go through and list a million things that I mess up on all the time. But He sent His Son, Jesus Christ, because just like these Israelites, we are a mess. And He sent His Son to pay the price for our failures, our constant failures. And so we celebrate. And the tradition that we have at Christmas is just a tradition. Jesus probably wasn't born on December 25th. Highly unlikely. Highly unlikely. There's no magical command in Scripture that says we have to have 4 candles on Sunday mornings for 4 weeks before Christmas. It's not there. Or which songs we have to sing that are Christmas carols or not. There's no law about this. But it's a good thing to do, so long as we don't start telling other people, well, if you didn't sing this Christmas carol this year, you must not really love Jesus. If you didn't do Advent this year, does your church even care? That's not the case. But we can rejoice. We can enjoy these celebrations, and we can remember, even if it's not perfect. Because again, Jesus probably wasn't born on December 25th. But as a church, we remember that, and for whatever reasons, we've picked this time to reflect back and to think on the work of Jesus Christ, who came and died for people like what we've read through the whole book of Judges. For people like you and for people like me. That's our hope. And as we recognize that, and as we see that the book of Judges is one piece amongst a whole, the whole story of the gospel of Jesus Christ, it displays our desperate need for Him. One of the other things that we do, this one actually is commanded. There's not very many things that are strictly commanded in Scripture, but one of them is that we take communion together. Jesus Himself said to do this. All of this in remembrance of our desperate need for Him. And so this morning we're going to do that. We're going to take communion as a church family. So I'm going to pause here for just a second. And we are not, in one sense, strict about this. The one rule, and again, this is a biblical thing, when we take communion, what it is it's a reflection and a reminding of ourselves the work of Christ in our lives. So the only thing I ask is that if you have not given yourself to the Lord and said, Jesus, I want to follow you, my heart and my soul is yours, my life is yours, and you are my glory, you are my hope, you are my King, then communion maybe isn't for you this morning. But if you've given your life to the Lord and you said, I will take up my cross and I will follow you. I am your disciple, I am your child, and I long for you above all things, then I welcome you to come and to participate in communion this morning. So I'm going to pause for a second. My wife is going to play a little bit of music. Feel free to come and to grab the cup and to grab the bread.